The Whiskey Rebellion. Almost everything we've been taught about it is based on a massive cover-up, and as usual, it leads to a myth that federal power is unbeatable. So don't resist it, don't defy it, because they'll just come in and crush you. But the real history is far different. It's actually a remarkable story of tax resistance that nullified the hated excise into oblivion. So on this episode, I'll get into all the juicy details with concrete examples from North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, and possibly more. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, February 17th, 2025. Let's first kick it off with what the official story is, the myth. What Murray Rothbard called in his great article on this, the official view of the Whiskey Rebellion. He writes that it is that 4 counties of western Pennsylvania refused to pay an excise tax on whiskey that had been levied by proposal of the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in the spring of 1791, as part of his excise tax proposal for federal assumption of the public debts of the several states. Western Pennsylvanians then failed to pay the tax, the view says, until protests, demonstrations, and some roughing up of tax collectors in western Pennsylvania caused President Washington to send in a 13,000-man army in the summer and fall of 1794 to suppress the insurrection in Pennsylvania. Rothbard continues, the official view is that a localized but dramatic challenge to federal tax levying authority had been met and defeated. The forces of federal law and order were safe. And believing this myth really has massive implications. It suggests that any challenge to federal power is doomed from the start. And in fact, we hear this all the time. People spreading propaganda in support of the centralized monster state anytime we teach people how the founders taught us to defeat unconstitutional federal programs. What the founders taught us was the actual check, the real check on the Constitution, the real enforcement mechanism of the Constitution. That's resistance by individuals and localities and states against any usurpation of power from Washington, D.C. We all hear this all the time. As soon as we start discussing that or providing examples in modern times, they'll say, well, good luck with that. I mean, we know right from the start, George Washington came in and shut down the Whiskey Rebellion just like that. And that's really the story that we hear, that any resistance, any nullification effort is doomed because we have an unbeatable centralized government armed with a massive army that will always destroy its opposition. But the real story is very much different. And let's start on that real story with Jacob E. Cook's great article. Well, this is a full paper, The Whiskey Insurrection, a Reevaluation. He points out that, first of all, opposition to the excise tax was by no means confined to western Pennsylvania. In fact, he writes, its opponents in other sections of the United States were just as vociferous in their denunciation of it and just as hostile to its enforcement. Kentucky, which we'll cover more so near the end, I think is the best example of this, and it had the greatest level of resistance. But he says, Kentucky, along with the rest of the West, was opposed to the excise. Western Virginia, now West Virginia, opposed it as vigorously as Western Pennsylvania did. The back country of the Carolinas and Georgia played an active part in opposition to it, arguing, as did the Pennsylvanians, that whiskey was to them a necessity and not a luxury. Let's go first through some events that happened in North Carolina. Here from Jeffrey Crow, his paper, The Whiskey Rebellion in North Carolina. He points out that kind of in the ramp up to passage of it, a circular letter from North Carolina Congressman John, I believe it's Sevier, who had once led the separatist state of Franklin, it candidly announced that the tax could not be collected in frontier areas. So he was looking at this, say, have you guys passed this? There's no way you're going to be able to collect, because I know the people in my state, in my country, as we'll hear how he says. And because of their remoteness, he predicted that North Carolina's westernmost counties could ignore the law with impunity. And on top of it, Sevier predicted a competitive advantage. He said, like, look, if you guys do this, they're not going to pay, and they're still going to sell their products, and they're going to sell it at a discount, and that's going to result in some real awesome stuff for us. He said, should the excise bill be passed, we shall derive great benefits from it. We can keep clear ourselves, as it would have a direct tendency to encourage emigration into our country and enable us to sell the production of our own distilleries lower than our neighbors. We know for a fact from more recent research in the last few decades that that's exactly what they did. They undercut prices, for example, when they sold their products in Virginia specifically, and pretty regularly this happened. So Sevier pretty much called it in the ramp up. And then once they went into effect, we know that there was quite a bit of resistance. Here from Crow's article, reports reaching Washington and Hamilton in the summer and fall of 1792 confirmed North Carolina's obstinacy and noncompliance. Evidently, Joseph McDowell Jr., inspector of the 5th Survey, which encompassed much of the western Piedmont and mountains of North Carolina, faced the most ferocious resistance. Indeed, it was likely he who was threatened with mutilation by a grindstone. So we weren't 100% certain which federal employee was threatened with this, but the research is suggesting that McDowell was threatened with mutilation by a grindstone should he try to continue collecting the excise. But as Jeffrey Crow points out, McDowell resigned his inspectorship. He's like, no way, I'm not doing this. Here's a letter from Tench Coxe to Alexander Hamilton in October of 1792. He points out that in the 5th or Western Survey of North Carolina, menaces of the property of the officers and strong dispositions to violence have appeared. So we're told, oh, this just happened in Pennsylvania, nowhere else, and then they crushed it. What happened to the story about North Carolina? It just doesn't exist in our textbooks. The schools, government-run schools, never teach this. But yet Tench Coxe knew what was going on. Hamilton knew what was going on. The irregularities in that survey, Coxe wrote, are not particularly stated by the inspector who resigned, nor yet by the supervisor, but it is generally mentioned by the former that he has been unable to execute the laws, and by the latter, the supervisor, that the discontents and dispositions to opposition which existed before had suddenly become very violent. There was pretty strong resistance going on in the Western Survey of North Carolina. He said, I consider that survey as the most opposed of any in the United States, except survey number 4 in Pennsylvania. So the resistance was very, very strong in North Carolina. Now back to Jeffrey Crow's article. He said, in short, the whiskey tax was flouted everywhere in North Carolina, even apparently by the excise men. He went through some research and some examples of where the excise men, even if they were getting stuff, they weren't passing it along. The expense of administering that law far outstripped collections, and evasion was widespread in North Carolina. At the end of 1792, William Polk had returned no money from country business, quote, owing to the deficiency of collectors, and he reported only $504.89 in duties on imported spirits. So we may think, okay, well, that's all they were supposed to collect. But this was a tiny amount because Tench Coxe estimated that for another period, July 1st, 1795 to June 30th, 1796, he estimated that based on production amounts historically, North Carolina should return around $16,278 in duties on spirits and stills. And in that period, they didn't even get $504. The state returned zero. So literally zero in that period when they were expecting 16,000 in duties on spirits and stills. So the resistance, again, was widespread. Evasion was widespread all over North Carolina. Now, here's Alexander Hamilton explaining it to George Washington as early as 1792. He said, in a great part of North Carolina, it has never been in any degree submitted to. So Hamilton, Washington, Tench Coxe, everyone else understood that in North Carolina, the resistance was massive, and it has never, in many parts of the state, it had never been complied with at all. Just 0% compliance. Moving on to Virginia. This is from Kevin Barksdale's great essay on this, Our Rebellious Neighbors. This is primarily in Western Virginia, bordering parts of Pennsylvania, but we did see some opposition in other areas of Virginia as well. He said the response to the excise tax and the effects of Western Pennsylvania's whiskey rebellion were particularly dramatic in the Virginia border counties of Ohio, Harrison, and I'm not sure how to say this, but I think it's Monongalia counties. If I'm incorrect, someone hopefully out there can help me out with this one. I get a lot of pronunciation help from people who are local in areas. So again, the resistance was dramatic in Ohio, Harrison, and Monongalia counties. The Virginia border counties, he said, were unquestionably entangled in the events surrounding the resistance to the excise tax on numerous fronts. And the resulting insurrection altered the social, economic, and political landscape of Virginia's Appalachian frontier. And he goes a little further. He gives a number of examples. I'm just going to highlight a few. Of course, this paper, his full essay and paper, will be included in the show notes, just like everything else, so you can read it in full, in context on your own time. But here's how Monongalia County Excise Officer William McCleary, he received a letter stating, quote, if he did not resign, he would be forced to give up his commission and his property would be destroyed. These are the same kind of tactics that were used against internal taxation, like the Stamp Act. All the Stamp Act protests and riots and resistance and nullification, the people's nullification of the Stamp Act, very similar in strategy. And so many of the people at this time certainly understood what that strategy was, and they were employing it again. I have not seen an article really comparing the resistance to the whiskey tax to the resistance to the Stamp Act, but the way I read it, it is very similar. McCleary offered this account of the warning that he received, quote, I am threatened from all quarters in my own country, and the Pennsylvanians came into our town and ordered me to give up my papers, as they would come and destroy them with all my property. In the meantime, no collection can go on, and our distillers will not pay till they see the event. So he was blaming it on Pennsylvanians, but it was certainly happening in Monongalia County, in Montgomery, for example, as well. Now, McCleary ended up ignoring the warning. He didn't think it was as legit as it really was. But his decision, Barksdale points out, ultimately forced him to disguise himself as a slave as he, quote, fled from his home, swam the river, and escaped. And then from there, Barksdale points out how Morgantown, which is now in West Virginia, was basically under siege by anti-excise protesters and rioters for a number of days. I'm not sure how long exactly, but for a while it became the center of anti-excise tax resistance. He said there was growing alarm among Governor Lee and various Virginia excise officials that additional Western counties might be influenced by those incidents in Morgantown. Edward Smith stated, quote, some of the distillers in Hampshire and Hardy counties, which join the boundaries of Monongalia, expressed their doubts of longer paying the duties and would embrace the earliest opportunity of noncompliance to the excise tax if they could calculate on protection in their opposition. So some people on the margins were already starting to say, like, look, this resistance is happening, and, you know, we're pretty good with just not complying with that now. What do you think? Concern, Barksdale point out, also emerged that distillers in Harrison and Randolph counties would be unwilling to comply with the excise law. The efforts of the whiskey rebels in Virginia seemed to be paying large dividends, and the siege of Morgantown had not yet ended. And here, even from the National Park Service, this is how they put it. One brief point that I wanted to say. They said that there was not one state south of New York whose western counties did not protest the new excise, with some sort of violence. This is very similar, again, to the resistance to the Stamp Act. It was widespread. It was all over the place. We generally hear more about it from Boston, but it certainly was happening, or New York, for example, but it was happening all over. And the same thing here. It wasn't just 4 counties in western Pennsylvania defying the feds. It was happening in Virginia. It was happening in North Carolina. We know it was in South Carolina, Georgia, Maryland, and elsewhere. But I'll get to a little bit more of that in just a moment. First of all, I wanted to point out that I know I'm mentioning a number of original source documents, but a bunch of long essays and articles discussing this in much more detail, plus Murray Rothbard's great article over at Mises.org. Those will all be included in a show notes section for the blog post for this episode. We get one published for every single episode. Alan Mosley does an awesome job getting that organized, including all the different platforms we're on, both video and audio-only podcast edition, plus the show links section, generally in the order of how I'm going through it in the episode again, so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. I will get that published a couple of hours after this live stream is done, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But let's get right back to it. And I really want to dive into what went down in Kentucky. And again, there's another long paper on this, The Whiskey Rebellion in Kentucky, a forgotten episode of civil disobedience. Here to kick it off, they write, it is difficult to organize a tax collection system for the Kentucky. It was difficult to organize a tax collection system for the Kentucky district and find people willing to serve as collectors because resignations almost kept pace with appointments. So one of the first problems they faced was merely just getting people to collect the tax. Again, very similar to what they did when they forced resignations in Philadelphia and Boston and New York to collecting the hated Stamp Act. Tench Cox, the commissioner of revenue in Philadelphia, suggested that Colonel Marshall, who was kind of the head dude in that region, encouraged complying distillers to inform on non-compliers. They were trying to create a system of narcs even back then in 1792 to 94 or so. But no one in Kentucky wanted to do that, even for 50% of the take. So there was a reward offered where you could get 50% of the penalties and fees for narking on other distillers who are not complying. And this was not good enough. Even paying them off was not doing it. So they couldn't find people to comply, and they were struggling with people who would even try to enforce it. Going further, the paper writes that the statute's complexity. So Hamilton made this pretty complex, and that was one of the issues, especially in Western Pennsylvania, where you had maybe not as much literacy. And we know that there was a lack of specie, and a lot of times people were using whiskey as a medium of exchange. And the law was very, very complex. And I believe it was William Findlay in Pennsylvania, just a quick aside, who argued a couple of years after it that he felt that Hamilton actually did it to set up a confrontation, to kind of assert the authority and power of the central government, which would make sense why they would cover up their failure if that seemed to have happened. Anyways, the statute's complexity aggravated Marshall's problems. Distillers were supposed to maintain records and make them available for inspection, but they simply ignored the paperwork. So they just didn't file the paperwork. Further, penalties were not to be charged against distillers who had only one still with a capacity of less than 50 gallons. But farmers who fell into that category didn't even bother to register, and avoidance of the law proceeded apace with evasion. On top of it, in Kentucky, we know that 0 charges, none, were brought by grand juries in the first 4 years. Zip. Nothing. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't prosecute anybody, even though everyone knew that no one was complying with the thing. And then on top of it, they tried to get a federal prosecutor to do things. And they write here, the first federal attorney, however, did not bring a single action in the court, although he was present every term. After he resigned in 1792, no one could be found to succeed him. President Washington tried to hire replacements to be the federal prosecutor for the whiskey tax in Kentucky. He went to people that he knew, friends. President Washington offered the job to an established lawyer and a kind of a strong Federalist, George Nicholas. And then to one just beginning his practice, John Breckinridge, who was the guy who ended up carrying Thomas Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions against the hated Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Both of them declined. Marshall thought that neither of them would have been recommended had they not been known to be opponents of the law. And he may have been right. But even one of his sons-in-law, William McClung, turned down the job. So they couldn't find people to act in the role of federal prosecutor on this. And as a Kentucky correspondent wrote to Senator John Brown, quote, "The excise is so very odious that no lawyer who has a reputation to lose will accept office." So no one was wanting the job because it was so unpopular in Kentucky. And then Hamilton decides to back down because he wants compliance. And so eventually Hamilton made a third proposal, that the distillers pay the excise in whiskey to be supplied to the Western Army. This was a kind of a custom that they would hand out certain amounts of whiskey. But this was an ingenious idea. Certainly, it sounded like it. Okay, you guys are having trouble with cash or specie. Why don't we just go with you paying in whiskey and we'll figure out the conversion on our end. But the distillers saw it as a trick and they would have none of it. That tactic was no more successful than the others had been. So mass resistance all over the place. And here, I'm trying to remember who the author of this essay is, but anyways, this is in the Journal of the Early Republic. Great essay. Together, these fragments reveal a remarkable story of tax evasion. It is the account of how almost the entire population of Kentucky managed to resist the laws of the United States for fully 8 years. That is so different than what we're told is the story of the whiskey tax and the Whiskey Rebellion. Again, 4 counties resisted for a couple of years here and there, and then they got a little too aggressive, and then they were crushed by military force. And so no one should resist today because that's how it happened right from the beginning, even when the good guys were doing it. But the real story is so different, especially in Kentucky, where no one was paying it. No one was getting prosecuted. Maybe there were a handful, but very, very few overall. And basically, almost the entire population of the state resisted the whiskey tax for 8 full years. And this is how Murray Rothbard again describes it. It wasn't just Kentucky, it was widespread. He said, from recent research, we now know that no one paid the tax on whiskey throughout the American backcountry. Well, I would say no one. It's not zero, but it's pretty close to it. That is the frontier areas of Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, and the entire state of Kentucky. President Washington and Secretary Hamilton, wrote Rothbard, chose to make a fuss about Western Pennsylvania precisely because in that region there was a cadre of wealthy officials who were willing to collect taxes. They were able to find some of their dudes who would go in and try to collect their taxes. They struggled there too. Such a cadre, wrote Rothbard, did not even exist in the other areas of the American frontier. There was no fuss or mass violence, I would say, against the tax collectors in Kentucky. You didn't really have a lot of it there. And the rest of the backcountry, because there was no one willing to be a tax collector. And maybe Rothbard, I think, a little overstates that because there certainly was violent responses in places like North Carolina. There were threats elsewhere as well, like in Western Virginia, but certainly nothing like what was going down in Pennsylvania. But the resistance, the noncompliance was massive throughout that backcountry. Now, going a little bit further, this is again to the paper on the Whiskey Rebellion in Kentucky. The spontaneity and tenacity of the movement is truly remarkable, especially considering the primitive nature of communication in that era. The near unanimity with which Kentuckians avoided and evaded the statutes would have astounded even Thoreau, Gandhi, and King. Man, I like how they sum that one up. But back to Rothbard. He points out that they really kind of covered this up Because if this was happening, there was a lot of resistance, and we don't hear about this resistance. They certainly didn't really talk about it publicly, but you do see some letters back and forth between Hamilton and Washington, Tench Cox and Hamilton, etc. But we don't get it in the public schools today, and they didn't get it in the government schools back then either. Rothbard writes, Washington, Hamilton, and the cabinet covered up the extent of the revolution because they didn't want to advertise the extent of their failure. They knew very well that if they tried to enforce or send an army into the rest of the backcountry, they would have failed. Kentucky and perhaps the other areas would have seceded from the Union then and there. Both contemporary sides then were happy to cover up the truth, and historians fell for the deception. And more importantly, well, not even more importantly, but without even getting too much further into this, they actually tried multiple times to make the law less oppressive. So they passed it in 1791. They saw all this resistance and noncompliance all over the place. So then they kind of backed down. They lowered the tax in 1792. Here, to address some of the Westerners' concerns, Congress modified the excise tax in May 1792 with, quote, an act concerning the duties on spirits distilled within the United States. I've got a link to that so you can read it on your own if you'd like. This reduced the duties somewhat and replaced the broad tax on whiskeys and stills with one limited to, quote, all spirits which shall be distilled within the United States, wholly or in part from molasses, sugar, or other foreign materials. So they made it more narrow, they reduced it, but that did not really stop the resistance at all. It just kept going on and on and on. And then they tried to modify it again in 1794. And there were some things that led up to it. In May of 1794, Federal District Attorney William Rawle issued more than 60 subpoenas to Pennsylvania distillers who had not paid the tax. The distillers were required to travel to Philadelphia to appear in the federal district court, a journey that most of them couldn't even afford. Congressman William Findley, who I mentioned just a few minutes ago, an Irish-born farmer representing southwestern Pennsylvania, urged relief. And so he was calling for this in Congress, and he convinced some other people to go along. And so they decided, like, okay, let's back this off a little bit. So the new act passed on June 5th, 1794, addressed some of the complaints. For instance, it allowed trials in state courts if the defendant was further than 50 miles from the federal district court. And the people on the federal side certainly understood that allowing prosecutions in state courts would end up with far more likely to have just no prosecutions at all. This was going to damage their enforcement capabilities even further. However, many Westerners still continued to refuse to pay the tax, and the rebellion continued to grow. So in Pennsylvania, the excise tax provoked a pretty overt resistance and overt rebellion that the George Washington administration wanted to show force against and try to crush. Alexander Hamilton was really trying to push for a military force going into North Carolina as well, but Attorney General Edmund Randolph, who really didn't want military at all, really kind of said, like, look, we don't really see any opportunity to be able to try to pull this off legally as well. But in Kentucky and elsewhere, the tax provoked a covert one that Federalists really wanted to cover up, to kind of still assert their power and authority, but not show that they would lose. Now, here back to Murray Rothbard. He says, rather than the whiskey tax rebellion being localized and swiftly put down, the true story turns out to be very different. The entire American backcountry was gripped by nonviolent, civil disobedient refusal to pay the hated tax on whiskey. No local juries could be found to convict tax delinquents. The Whiskey Rebellion was actually widespread and successful, and it eventually forced the federal government to repeal the excise tax. So who's the winner here? Not only could they not get it enforced, and in some areas it was zero enforcement, zero collection. And then on top of it, the federal government tried to back down not once, but twice, and they still couldn't get it enforced. And then even after the show of military strength, they still couldn't get it enforced, and eventually they just repealed it. So the real story here then, rather than the story of unlimited federal power, the Whiskey Rebellion then, properly understood, was actually a victory for noncompliance, resistance, and other forms of nullification as the tool to enforce the Constitution that the framers and Federalists actually taught us to use. And as Rothbard put it, it was also a victory for liberty and property and a defeat of federal power and taxation. There's no surprise to me that we don't learn about any of this in the government-run schools. So we've got you covered. We're doing our best to reach and teach more and more people about this essential, foundational, and totally forgotten and ignored history. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you support our work, you can pitch in and help us out a great deal for as little as $2 a month. We punch way above our weight class here at the 10th Amendment Center. You can join us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Or if you prefer to make a one-time contribution to help our work, you can do that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Again, all spelled out. I really appreciate any consideration you can give to putting your financial faith behind our work today. Thank you so much for watching. Please help us spread the word in some other ways by hitting the like button, leaving reviews on the podcast platform, subscribe, get notifications, comments in the archive. The more watch time you have, all this stuff helps out a great deal. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you had an awesome weekend. I hope this one made you think. I hope you learned something that's more important than anything. And I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.